A few months ago, a friend of mine, one of the smartest people I know actually, decided to quit his stable job to launch a startup.
Oh, wow. Big leap.
Huge leap. And when I asked to see his business plan, the basics, he just laughed, waved me off.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. That's just paperwork, he said. And he had this incredible spark in his eye, really believed it. He leaned in and quoted, almost like it was this sacred mantra, imagination is more important than knowledge.
The classic Einstein quote, or often attributed to him anyway.
Exactly. He was completely convinced his raw creativity was enough. Conquer the market, details sort themselves out, that sort of thing.
And how did that turn out? Let me guess.
Well, last week, I saw him again. The startup, gone, collapsed. Just a mess of debt, broken promises.
Oof, that's tough.
It really was. And that spark, replaced by this weary confusion. He had the imagination, sure, but he completely ignored the knowledge, the paperwork that could have saved him. It was just such a brutal reminder of this strange human habit we have. We hear a powerful quote from someone like Einstein, and we treat it like a universal law, not just advice.
The authority effect.
Yeah, the weight of the name blinds us. It turns inspiration into, justification for recklessness. And just got me thinking, why? Why are we so willing to just surrender our own judgment to a beautifully phrased sentence or to charismatic authority in general? Okay, let's unpack this. The question we face today is really why we are so willing to surrender our critical judgment. Not just to quotes, but to, charismatic authority figures.
Right.
That authority could be a scientific genius like Einstein, sure. But it could just as easily be, say, an executive with a string of past successes, or maybe a revolutionary leader with a really compelling vision. We want to look at the mechanism of that surrender.
Exactly. And we're going to try and move past just the philosophy of it, that we surrender judgment and really dive into the psychological and even the neurobiological mechanics behind it. So when we analyze, for instance, why a brilliant executive might push a really flawed strategy just because they have that halo effect from past wins.
Right. Their previous success blinds the board, maybe even themselves.
Precisely. Or, why a public might uncritically follow a very charismatic political figure, especially maybe in an emerging democracy during uncertain times. We're actually looking at the same fundamental failure of independent judgment as your friend with the startup.
Okay, so it's a broader pattern.
It is. And to really map this process, we're going to explore some pretty high-stakes research specifically, studies looking at radicalization and political extremism.
Whoa, okay. That seems like a massive leap, going from a failed startup or a bad corporate strategy straight to political extremism. Aren't we risking generalizing too much here?
It's a fair question. It definitely sounds like a leap. But extremism actually gives us the clearest, most amplified map of how influence really works.
How so?
Well, think about it. Radicalization is essentially a fast motion version of this process. It shows how someone moves from just having an opinion, maybe some passive sympathy, to taking decisive, often dangerous action.
Okay, so it's the transition that's key.
Exactly. By studying these really high-stakes situations where the outcomes are literally life and death, we get crucial insights into the specific cognitive levers, the social dynamics, that get pulled to essentially rewire belief and trigger measurable behavior. And these levers, well, they operate in all of us.
So the same mechanisms might explain why someone joins a terror cell, or why someone ignores basic business principles because a quote sounded good.
That's the idea. The intensity is different, obviously, but the underlying psychological and neurological processes share some really important common ground.
Okay, so if we're trying to trace these mechanics, how people move towards extreme action, where did researchers even start looking? Decades ago, I mean. They must have started with the existing theories, right? Social science, psychology.
They absolutely did. For decades, researchers tried applying all sorts of foundational psychological and social theories. And the consistent finding, really across the board, was that no single theory could fully explain this movement towards radical action. Scholars tried everything: psychiatry, sociology, rational choice economics, you name it. It often resulted in 20 or more competing models, and each one only seemed to capture a tiny sliver of the truth.
Right. Let's start with maybe the most obvious one, the psychological angle.
Yeah.
The idea that extremist violence must be driven by, mental illness. That must have been the first stop for many.
It certainly was. Psychoanalytical theories early on pretty much assumed that people engaging in extremist violence must suffer from some severe mental illness or, some form of psychopathology.
That their actions were just irrational, aberrant.
Exactly. And the appeal was clear, right? If you can pathologize the behavior, maybe you can control it, treat it, contain it.
Makes sense.
But while some studies did note that, yes, individual actors might show underlying traits, maybe narcissism or novelty-seeking tendencies, that sort of thing, the overall consensus has really moved away from simple personality or psychoanalytic theories explaining the group phenomenon.
Why is that?
Well, just look at the sheer number of people involved in some large-scale movements. You simply can't explain that collective action away by saying they're all individually mentally ill. It doesn't hold up.
Okay.
Researchers now generally accept that most individuals involved, they often do understand conventional ideas of right versus wrong. The shift is that they become motivated to engage in those wrong behaviors because of these complex psychosocial processes that effectively redefine morality for them within their group context.
Okay, so not simple pathology. What about the socioeconomic angle? The idea that poverty, lack of opportunity, classic deprivation theories. Are those the main drivers?
Well, they're definitely powerful factors in the environment, no doubt. But again, they seem insufficient on their own to cause the action.
How so?
The older models, like the frustration-aggression model, basically suggested that aggression just comes from being blocked from achieving your goals. It linked frustration pretty directly to, say, objective poverty or feeling powerless.
Right.
Then there's the slightly more nuanced idea of relative deprivation that focuses on the tension between what a group feels they should have versus what they actually have.
Okay, that sounds plausible.
It does, but the evidence against it being the primary mechanism is pretty overwhelming.
For example?
Well, look at the research on planners for groups like Al-Qaeda and other major terrorist organizations. It consistently shows they often tend to be highly educated people. Many come from middle or even upper class backgrounds.
Not the impoverished individuals the simple deprivation models would predict.
Exactly. So socioeconomic conditions are definitely part of the, let's call it the shaping environment, the background context, but they don't seem to be the direct catalyst for action in most cases.
Which brings us, I guess, to the economic counterpoint. The idea that these actions are actually purely rational. That extremism is just the result of a calculated cost-benefit analysis.
Yes, the domain of pure rational choice models. These assume people act rationally, they have all the information they need, and they're always trying to maximize their personal rewards.
Does that hold up?
It can explain some things, like maybe tactical shifts, why a group might switch targets if security gets tighter at airports, for instance. That seems like a rational calculation.
Okay.
But these models completely fail when it comes to explaining large-scale, self-sacrificing behavior or just plainly non-rational actions.
Like the soldier you mentioned earlier, the one who won't fire his weapon.
Precisely. That famous World War II combat research is a stark example. It suggested, shockingly, that maybe as many as 85% of infantrymen failed to actually fire upon the enemy in direct combat.
Even though winning the fight was rationally beneficial, obviously, for self-preservation.
Right. The psychological barriers to killing, the sort of innate human resistance, seemed to overwhelm the purely rational choice in that moment for many.
Wow.
And there's more. A detailed study of Lebanese religious terrorists found that very few individuals who rationally believed terrorism would advance their political cause actually went on to become terrorists.
So the belief wasn't enough.
No. The decision to actually act violently required some kind of psychological leap, a transformation that simple cost-benefit analysis just couldn't predict or explain. We clearly needed a framework that could somehow integrate the belief, the environment, and the action.
So if all these established fields, psychology, sociology, economics, fall short on their own, what framework do researchers use now? How do they combine all these pieces?
That leads us to what's often called the strategic multi-layer assessment, or sometimes the Semicali two pyramids framework.
So pyramids.
Yes. This model is pretty foundational now because it explicitly acknowledges that radicalization, that's the belief part, and mobilization, the action part, are distinct, non-linear processes. They don't always line up neatly.
Okay, so it separates thinking from doing.
Exactly. It cleanly separates the cognitive state, what you believe, from the behavioral state, what you actually do, which, as we saw, don't always match.
Interesting. So walk us through how these two pyramids work together, side by side.
Okay, the first one is the opinion pyramid. You can think of this as the belief state. It basically measures ideological commitment.
Right.
At the very bottom, you have people who are neutral on the issue. Moving up, you find sympathizers. They kind of agree with the cause, but aren't deeply invested. Then you get justifiers, people who actively rationalize or defend extremist actions, even if they don't act themselves.
At the top.
At the very peak of the opinion pyramid is what they call personal moral obligation, or PMO.
PMO.
Meaning the individual feels personally compelled by their own moral code, their religious beliefs, whatever it is, to actually act for the cause. They feel they must do this. It's not just an opinion anymore, it's a perceived duty.
Okay, that's the belief side. What's the second pyramid?
The second is the action pyramid, or the behavioral state. This one tracks what people actually do. At the base, you have the inert, those who do nothing, regardless of their beliefs.
Right.
Above them, you find legal activists, people taking nonviolent authorized action, like protesting legally. Then you move up to radicals or illegal activists. They engage in prohibited actions, maybe property destruction or even violence, but not necessarily targeting civilians in the way we define terrorism.
And the peak of the action pyramid.
That's where you find terrorists, those who commit violent acts specifically targeting civilians to achieve their political aims.
Okay, so two separate tracks. And the key insight is?
The key insight here is that someone can be way up on one pyramid and low down on the other. You could have an individual at that peak PMO level of belief feeling morally obligated to act, but they remain inert on the action pyramid. They never actually do anything.
The reverse.
Or the reverse. You could have someone who's only a mere sympathizer on the belief pyramid, but they become a legal activist, maybe joining protests because their friends are doing it. The two don't automatically correlate.
That really clarifies why belief doesn't always equal action. Okay, so what drives the movement between these states? What pushes someone up either pyramid? What are the engine and the spark here?
Good question. We generally categorize the drivers into two main types. First, there are what we call shaping factors. These are the broad collective environmental conditions. Think politics, social norms, economic context, the whole landscape that everyone exists within. It's like the cultural medium where everything else happens.
Okay, the background.
Exactly. And second, crucially, there are the transition factors. These are the specific, often individualized phenomena that act as the actual engine, the push.
And they can push both ways.
Yes. They function either as activators or catalysts, things that push someone towards extremism or action, or they can be inhibitors or interventions, things that stall that progression or even reverse it, pushing them back down the pyramid.
So the success or failure of, say, an extremist movement really hinges on how well they can manipulate these transition factors.
Precisely. It's about leveraging those catalysts and overcoming the inhibitors. That's the dynamic we need to understand.
Okay, so before we dig into those specific triggers, those transition factors, you said we need to understand the environment first, the shaping factors. And you mentioned this is where it gets really interesting, especially with, well, our modern digital lives changing how our brains even process information within that cultural environment.
Absolutely. The collective level shaping factors are just fundamental. You really can't overstate the importance of culture. It's not just, the setting or the backdrop. It's the actual medium through which individuals come to be, to feel, to think, to do, as some researchers put it.
So you can't just pull a person out of their cultural context and analyze their motives in a vacuum.
You really can't. That cultural context forms the core cognitive framework, the emotional landscape, the motivational structure, everything about how they perceive and react to the world.
And within that culture, stories or narratives seem to be the glue holding that framework together, right?
We rely heavily on what are called master narratives.
Master narratives.
Yeah, these are the really deep-seated, often historically grounded stories that reflect a community's shared identity, their past traumas, their hopes, their values. It's all embedded in these narratives.
And they provide the context.
They provide the essential context and the framing needed to make sense of current events, often very quickly. For instance, researchers often talk about the enduring power of the Crusader narrative in some Islamic cultures. It provides a kind of ready-made frame for interpreting modern conflicts as just a continuation of that historical struggle.
Right. So if extremists can tap into and exploit these existing master narratives, they don't need to invent a whole new philosophy from scratch.
Exactly. They just plug their ideology into a pre-existing, emotionally powerful framework.
And that makes it instantly more resonant.
Instantly. It strengthens that us versus them dynamic immediately. It gives the ideology a sense of historical weight, validation, legitimacy. It feels like it's part of something ancient and profound.
We see that kind of thing elsewhere too, right? Like taking historical figures out of context.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very powerful tool and often used in politics. You see it sometimes when the philosophies of historical revolutionary figures get decontextualized.
How does that work?
Well, in some post-colonial societies, for example, political narratives might strip away all the complexity and nuance from a founding leader's actual ideology. They turn it into a simplistic, almost anachronistic mantra.
Why?
Often, it's purely to justify current power structures, or maybe to hinder progressive development that might challenge the status quo. The real, detailed knowledge of the historical context is ignored for the sake of the imagination of a simplified, heroic past that serves a present agenda. It's another version of your friend's story, in a way.
Wow. Okay. And if an outside force, maybe trying to promote different values, comes in and tries to counter that narrative?
They could actually make things significantly worse.
Really? How?
Well, some research, including work touching on genomics and cultural psychology, suggests that if you try to promote concepts, let's say liberal democracy, in cultures where those ideas run directly counter to deeply ingrained foundational beliefs or master narratives, it's likely to be perceived not as helpful, but as an aggressive act.
Like a psychological attack.
Exactly. It can register as a direct psychological attack on their identity, their history, their core values. Not just a friendly suggestion. And this is a big reason why many external interventions fail. They're trying to operate outside the subject's established cultural reality without understanding the power of those master narratives.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's shift down from the big cultural picture to the individual cognitive level.
Yeah.
We've talked about the environment shaping beliefs, but how does the actual format of the information we receive affect how vulnerable we are to being influenced?
The format is crucial. It affects how quickly attitudes are formed and how deeply they stick. And we have some pretty clear neuroscientific evidence on this. Specifically, information we get through images tends to elicit much quicker and stronger emotional responses compared to just reading text. It's fundamentally a processing speed issue in the brain.
Interesting. Tell us a bit more about that mechanism. Where does an image go in the brain compared to text?
So, when you see an image, the visual information travels along an incredibly fast pathway. It goes from the visual cortex more or less directly to the amygdala.
The amygdala being?
That's the brain's primary hub for emotional processing. Fear, pleasure, anger. It's central. This rapid route allows for an almost immediate emotional response, sometimes even before your higher level thinking, your rational brain, fully kicks in to evaluate it.
In text?
Text processing is different. It often requires more resource-heavy frontal lobe activity, things like sequencing words, interpreting grammar, understanding abstract concepts. That whole process is generally slower.
So there's more time for the rational parts of the brain to weigh in.
Exactly. It provides more opportunity for the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought and judgment, to interject, to analyze, to question before the full emotional response takes hold.
So if I see a really shocking photo scroll past on my feed, the emotional hit comes first, before my brain really has time to ask, hang on, is this image even real? What's the context here?
That's fundamentally the effect, yes. Images act as a kind of powerful cognitive glue. They can instantly connect otherwise disparate events in your mind, help construct a narrative very quickly, and significantly increase the extremity of your evaluation based purely on that immediate emotional input. And you can bet this is deliberately used in the digital world.
Which brings us squarely to the digital landscape. This is where cyber-based communication technology, CBCT as the researchers call it, seems to change everything. What specific cognitive shifts are we seeing in younger generations, the sort of digital natives, that might make them particularly susceptible to this kind of visual emotional influence?
Right. The sheer ubiquity of CBCT, smartphones, social media platforms, the algorithms driving them, it has fundamentally rewired those shaping factors we talked about. It massively increases the volume, the diversity, and maybe most critically, the sheer rate of information flow.
And digital natives, people who grew up with this, how are they different?
Research suggests a few key differences or vulnerabilities. First, they often exhibit shorter attention spans. And perhaps counterintuitively, they sometimes show a higher level of trust in the technology itself and in the information generated by it.
Higher trust. Interesting. What else?
Second, they frequently use media, often almost subconsciously, as a way to regulate their mood.
How do you mean?
If they feel bored or tired or anxious, the immediate reaction is often to switch attention. Flick to a new app, scroll to a new video, find something stimulating to change that feeling instantly.
That sounds exhausting and definitely not conducive to sitting down and deeply thinking about something complex.
It creates a very high cognitive load, yes, but it's a load they've adapted to manage in a way. And this connects to the third difference, their skill in processing nonlinear information.
Nonlinear.
Yeah. Traditional cognitive models assumed we need sequential storytelling. A leads to B leads to C. Digital natives, while they still need context eventually, seem highly adept at picking up fragments, a bit of A here, some C over there, a flash of B from maybe 27 different platforms within an hour. They're constantly switching media inputs.
And they piece the narrative together from these fragments.
They reconstruct it, often very rapidly. Their brains are wired for that kind of fragmented, fast-paced input.
Okay, so let's put that package together. You have potentially shorter attention spans, high trust in the tech delivering the info, using media constantly for mood regulation and processing information in this rapid, nonlinear, fragmented way.
What does that create? It seems to create a population that is potentially highly malleable.
Malleable how?
If you trust the platform delivering the content and you're constantly seeking quick emotional hits or distractions to manage your mood, you become easily influenced by fast-moving, visually driven, emotionally charged narratives, especially narratives that might lack the full context or nuance that slower text-based processing might demand or allow for.
So the digital environment itself is shaping minds to be more receptive to impulsive belief based on emotion.
That seems to be a significant part of the picture, yes.
Yeah.
The environment is being shaped for fast, emotionally resonant belief, often bypassing deeper critical analysis. Okay, so if those shaping factors, the culture, the narratives, the way digital media primes us, define the landscape and prepare the mind for potentially fast emotional belief, then the transition factors are the actual spark.
Right, the things that push people up the pyramids.
Exactly. These are the specific, often very individualized psychological and social dynamics that actually propel a person up those two pyramids we talked about, pushing them from just believing something towards actually taking action.
And within those transition factors, what stands out is the most potent accelerator, the factor that seems to make us just completely abandon rational, calculated thought, like my friend with the startup.
Well, based on the research, particularly in extremism, but with broader implications, the most powerful catalyst appears to be the invocation of sacred values.
Sacred values, define that for us.
These are core beliefs. They could be religious tenets, deeply held national identities, fundamental moral norms that an individual considers absolutely non-negotiable, untouchable, absolute.
So they're rooted in the culture, the shaping factors.
They are rooted in the culture, yes. But it's the perception that one of these sacred values is being violated or attacked that acts as the most potent catalyst for mobilization, for action.
And you mentioned earlier that the brain reacts differently to this. It's more profound than just feeling angry. What does the neurobiology actually show us about decision-making when a sacred value is threatened?
The research here is genuinely stunning. Using fMRI scans to watch the brain in action, studies found that when people process statements related to their sacred values, specific neural systems light up.
Which ones?
Primarily areas associated with evaluating rights and wrongs. Specifically, the temporal parietal junction, or TPJ, that helps us process fairness and understand others' intentions, and the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, the VLPFC, which deals with semantic rules and understanding meaning.
Okay, so the brain's morality and fairness circuits are firing.
Yeah.
What's not active? That seems key.
That's the crucial part. The brain systems associated with utility estimations, the regions involved in cost-benefit analysis, they go quiet. They are relatively silent.
Wait, hang on. The part of the brain responsible for calculating risk, reward, weighing options, optimizing outcomes, that just doesn't light up.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests. That complex calculator in our prefrontal cortex seems to be bypassed.
So you're saying that rational incentives offering rewards, money, status, or threatening negative consequences like jail time, social ostracization, they literally might disappear from the decision-making equation in that moment. That part of the brain just switches off its influence.
That is the profound implication. When a value is deemed sacred, individuals appear to fail to make trade-offs. The standard tools of negotiation, deterrence, rational persuasion, they become ineffective, or potentially even counterproductive.
because the brain has structurally bypassed the whole cost-benefit computation system.
It appears so. A threat to that sacred value isn't processed as a problem to be solved rationally. It's perceived as a direct psychological attack that demands an immediate, non-negotiable defense, regardless of the practical costs.
And this isn't just about extremism, is it? You can see this in other areas, like the boardroom example.
Absolutely. Think about executives or leaders who hold certain strategies or past achievements as sacred cows. Beliefs or ways of doing things they consider absolute, non-negotiable because of past success or deep conviction.
The halo effect again?
Right. If those become sacred values, they may fail to rationally evaluate the utility, the costs and benefits of pivoting or changing course, even when market conditions drastically change. The data suggesting a change might not even register properly if it conflicts with that sacred value.
Wow. And CBCT, our digital communication tech, with its speed and reach, it just pours gasoline on this fear, doesn't it?
It's a massive accelerant. One-to-many communication, think Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, allows a perceived threat to a sacred value to be broadcast globally, instantaneously.
Turning a local incident into a worldwide trigger.
Exactly. It triggers massive, coordinated emotional responses across huge, disparate communities almost overnight. The example often cited is that video showing U.S. Marines desecrating bodies. Within hours, that went viral globally. It instantly propagated the perception of a profound violation of core religious values, human dignity values, fueling outrage and radical sentiment far beyond the initial location.
Okay, sacred values are a huge catalyst. Let's talk about maybe a more common source of fuel. Grievance. Just feeling dissatisfied. That's universal. How does that personal pain get transformed into collective action?
Right. Grievances are incredibly powerful motivators. It could be dissatisfaction over economic inequality, lack of housing, perceived human rights abuses, discrimination. The list is long.
Like the Arab Spring example.
That's a classic example, yes. Famously triggered, at least symbolically, by the very personal grievance of Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian street vendor who set himself on fire after his cart was confiscated by police. That act of desperation tapped into widespread latent grievances. But, and this is critical, social psychology makes a really important distinction here. While personal grievances create this large pool of potentially ready recruits, people who are generally unhappy or feel wronged, a personal grievance on its own is highly unlikely to lead to large-scale group sacrifice.
Why?
Because it needs to be reframed. It has to be interpreted as representative of a group grievance. One person's suffering is a personal tragedy. It only becomes a catalyst for widespread political action when it's successfully framed as an attack on the entire collective identity, on us.
So the technology's role here is to take my problem and convincingly turn it into our fight.
Precisely. CBCT has dramatically lowered the cost and the barriers for anyone to become a publisher of their own pain, their own grievance. You can broadcast it instantly, blogs, microblogs, social media posts.
And find others who feel the same way.
Exactly. It allows others who share a similar sense of marginalization or the same specific grievance to find each other easily. This creates online spaces for dialogue, for shared validation, for social support, but crucially, this shared space often amplifies the initial grievance.
How does it amplify it?
Through shared storytelling, mutual reinforcement, and often by collectively identifying an external enemy responsible for the shared suffering. It reframes individual setbacks into a collective battle against a common foe. My problem becomes our shared injustice, demanding collective action.
And that shared online space where everyone seems to agree and feel the same way, that's where maybe the uncertainty starts to fade and more rigid viewpoints can form.
That brings us directly to the interplay between anomie and uncertainty. Anomie, classically, is that feeling of normlessness, like the social rules are breaking down, a sense of being adrift.
Okay.
When individuals feel high levels of uncertainty, maybe about themselves, their identity, or a major conflict like the political situation, they become powerfully motivated to join groups. Specifically, groups that feel relevant to their identity and, crucially, offer clear answers and strong norms.
So they're seeking clarity, trying to resolve that uncomfortable feeling of uncertainty.
They're looking for cognitive certainty, exactly. They want to reduce that cognitive conflict. There's compelling empirical research from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that showed this really clearly.
What did it find?
It found that having a strong Palestinian identity by itself wasn't enough to predict strong support for extreme actions like suicide bombings. That strong identity only correlated with high support for violence when the respondents also reported feeling highly uncertain either about the conflict's future or about themselves personally.
And those with strong identity but low uncertainty.
They were significantly less likely to support the bombings. The uncertainty acted like a spark. It drove individuals to seek out the most extreme, most clear-cut, most identity-affirming actions offered by their group affiliation as a way to resolve that uncertainty.
And the technology we use every day, you're saying it actively makes this worse. It pushes people towards a specific conclusion.
In many ways, yes, unintentionally. Think about how internet technology works. Search engines, social media algorithms. They are fundamentally designed to learn your past preferences and filter information to keep you engaged.
To show you more of what you already like or agree with.
Exactly. Which is useful for finding relevant information or products, sure, but it has a significant side effect. It can unintentionally drive people toward what researchers call a self-fulfilled foregone conclusion.
Meaning you only see things that confirm what you already believe.
Precisely. It creates the infamous echo chamber effect. You're surrounded by voices and information that reflect and reinforce your existing views.
And what happens inside these echo chambers?
Two really dangerous cognitive errors tend to flourish. First is the illusion of false consensus. The individual starts to seriously overestimate how widespread their own possibly extreme perspective actually is within the general population. They think everyone thinks like this.
Because everyone they see online does.
Right. And second, because CBCT makes it so easy for people with fairly rare or niche interests or beliefs to find each other and form groups, radicals can develop what's called the illusion of large numbers.
The illusion of large numbers.
Yeah. They might see a few thousand members in their specific online forum or group, and they start to believe this is just the tip of the iceberg, that there must be millions more out there who secretly agree with them.
When in reality,
that small, vocal online community might actually represent the absolute ceiling of support for that particular extreme ideology, but they don't see that. They become convinced they're part of a huge, righteous, potentially global majority that's just waiting for the right moment to act.
that is a frankly terrifying combination. Feeling absolutely certain about your extreme beliefs and believing you have massive hidden support ready to back you up.
It is. And then we need to overlay one final layer of psychological acceleration. The basic, hardwired neural desire for reward.
Dopamine.
Dopamine, exactly. Humans are fundamentally wired to seek reward that dopamine release feels good and to avoid loss, which involves different systems like the anterior cingulate cortex or ACC. This basic drive for reward and affirmation can, especially online, lead to some highly dangerous and extreme behaviors.
Okay, connect that dopamine loop specifically back to digital behavior and radicalization.
Well, think about what happens when someone engages in extremist behaviors online. Maybe they post inflammatory opinions, share provocative images, attack perceived enemies.
Okay.
If they receive immediate positive reinforcement likes, shares, supportive comments, new followers who echo their views, they get a powerful, pleasurable dopamine hit. It feels good. It feels affirming.
And that creates a feedback loop.
An immediate, powerful feedback loop. Research on things like internet addiction actually shows that addicts often exhibit enhanced sensitivity to rewards and, really importantly, decreased sensitivity to potential losses or negative consequences.
So they become less concerned about the downsides.
Yes. They might become less worried about long-term consequences, things like getting fired from a job, getting arrested, alienating friends or family, because the immediate short-term hit of online affirmation and reward is so neurochemically powerful.
So the very design of many online platforms, seeking engagement through likes and shares, inadvertently ends up rewarding users for escalating their opinions and behaviors towards the extreme if that's what gets the affirmation.
That seems to be a major risk. The constant interactivity, the immediate feedback, the sense of achievement or validation you get from online affirmation, it can drive this relentless escalation. This self-reinforcing digital feedback loop can propel someone non-linearly up those action and opinion pyramids, sometimes towards real-world violence.
And again, you can see echoes of this outside extremism, right? Like the successful leader example.
Absolutely. Think about that successful executive again, intoxicated by the reward of past successes, reinforced by the affirmation and status that came with them, that halo effect. They might continually pursue higher risk strategies, ignoring warning signs, decreased loss sensitivity, because those initial successes created such a pleasurable sense of affirmation and perceived invulnerability. It can lead to major organizational missteps that psychologically mirror the kind of reckless reward-seeking mindset we saw in my friend who ignored the knowledge for the imagination in a startup. The underlying driver is similar. Hashtag tag outro.
So we started this deep dive with a very personal story, didn't we? A failure rooted in surrendering basic practical knowledge to an inspiring, authoritative quote. But what we've seen, looking through this high-stakes lens of political extremism research, is that the suspension of rational judgment, it isn't just random, it's not just a personal failing. It seems to follow clear, almost systemic pathways.
Right. Pathways strongly influenced by our environment, our culture, and now powerfully amplified by the digital tools we use constantly.
Yeah, the digital world really acts like a massive accelerant in this whole process, doesn't it? It seems capable of transforming vulnerability, uncertainty, grievance into coordinated action with terrifying speed.
It does, partly by attacking those sacred values we talked about, framing personal dissatisfaction as a collective fight, and crucially, by constantly rewarding and reinforcing the most extreme thinking that gets engagement.
And the neurobiology backs this up.
The neurobiological insights are key, I think. Understanding that quick emotional processing triggered by images and that structural bypass of cost-benefit analysis when a sacred value gets challenged. It shows our brains are, in some ways, inherently vulnerable to this kind of rapid, non-rational influence.
So it's a convergence.
It's the convergence of these, hardwired responses with the very architecture of CBCT, the speed, the potential for anonymity, the echo chambers it creates. Together, they forge an incredibly powerful mechanism for mass influence. We have to understand, this isn't just about bad ideas floating around. It's about how the technology itself interacts with our most basic psychological needs. Our need for certainty, for belonging, for reward.
I think the crucial takeaway for me, and perhaps for you listening, is just understanding how quickly someone can potentially transition from passive belief, maybe just sympathy, to decisive, even extreme action when the environment and the technology sort of conspire to reduce that cognitive friction and just maximize emotional affirmation. We're all potentially susceptible to surrendering our judgment when the right levers are pulled in the right context.
And the ongoing evolution of CBCT is profoundly affecting not just behavior, but potentially brain structure and attention patterns on a global scale. If our modern information environment is increasingly designed, intentionally or not, to reward immediate emotional and often extreme responses, and if our own neurobiology allows us to completely abandon cost-benefit analysis when core values feel threatened, then, we really have to consider what the inevitable long-term global cognitive shift might actually be.